Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey that will make you question not only the definition of spirituality, but also the very concept of personal boundaries. Forget the peaceful meditation gardens, the serene chanting monks, and the candlelit temples where everyone is apparently too enlightened to notice you stepped on their shoe. No, we're going to talk about spiritual leaders who decided that divine calling came with a side order of deeply suspicious behavior. You know, the ones who would have been politely asked to leave the monastery gift shop if they were alive today. This is most enthusiastic spiritual leaders in history, except we're keeping it YouTube friendly, so every unsettling incident will be translated into safe, family-friendly metaphors. Think less explicit and more, oh dear, why is the guru smiling like that at the bread basket? Imagine it. You've woken up in a centuries-old monastery, the air thick with incense and mystery. Bells chime in the distance, summoning the faithful for morning prayer. You stumble into the courtyard expecting solemnity, humility, and maybe a little bit of that quiet monk aesthetic Instagram filters are always chasing. Instead, you're greeted by the sight of Brother Ambrose, a man who clearly missed the celibacy part of the vows, but mastered the lingering handshake chapter of the training manual. His eyes sparkle not with divine wisdom, but with the same expression your local used car salesman gets when you mention you have cash on hand. And he's just the opening act. Because here's the thing, the line between spiritual charisma and "this is starting to feel weird" has been tiptoed across for centuries. People in robes have been using their mystical authority to bend rules, break comfort zones, and generally behave in ways that make you want to check the return policy on your soul. In medieval Europe, the parish priest wasn't just the keeper of your moral health. For some, he was also the self-appointed judge of how close a holy embrace could get before it became a public scandal. In other corners of the world, gurus claimed to purify followers through awkwardly specific rituals that somehow always required candlelight, locked doors, and a strange insistence on relaxing your shoulders. It's not just a cultural thing either. These spiritual opportunists pop up everywhere, from sun-scorched desert hermitages to lush Himalayan retreats where the tea is always warm, and so are the guru's hands. They know the art of the holy excuse, that perfectly vague justification for why you have to stand in exactly that position for exactly that long during exactly this hour of the lunar cycle. And because they wrap it in scripture, ritual, or pseudo-mystical word salads, people go along with it. After all, no one wants to be the one to question a man who claims he's on speaking terms with the cosmos. But let's be honest, the awkwardness is eternal. Thousands of years ago, some spiritual leader was probably explaining to a wide-eyed villager that divine wisdom can only be absorbed by holding his hand for 20 uninterrupted minutes while humming in a key that sounds suspiciously like sighing. And thousands of years from now, some alien archaeologist will dig up our sacred texts, read about these so-called blessings, and make the exact same face you're making right now. So, welcome to this journey, where we'll walk barefoot through centuries of spiritual overreach, duck under swinging incense burners, and tiptoe past the meditation cushions that smell faintly of manipulation. This isn't just history. This is the awkward side of holiness, preserved for eternity like an ancient relic no one wants to claim ownership of. And trust me, this is just the warm-up. The really uncomfortable blessings are still ahead. Picture it, a stone monastery perched on a cliffside, the wind howling through narrow corridors, candlelight flickering in drafty prayer halls. Silence is the rule here. Meals are taken in complete quiet. Footsteps echo like they're being judged by the saints themselves. And then there's Brother Clement, the man who, according to the local novices, single-handedly invented the holy side hug. On paper, Brother Clement was a model monk. He prayed more than he slept, copied manuscripts in beautiful calligraphy, and could recite entire psalms without blinking. But in practice, he had one little quirk. He believed that spiritual connection was best expressed by standing uncomfortably close to people. Not front to front, oh no, that would have been obvious. He specialized in the diagonal, the half embrace, the side hug that lingers just long enough for you to start mentally reviewing the monastery's exit routes. You'd see him coming after morning prayer, robes swishing, a gentle smile plastered across his face. At first you'd think, oh, how kind, a friendly monk offering a brotherly greeting. But as his arms settled across your shoulders, you'd realize this wasn't a casual tap and release. This was a commitment. The side hug had entered what scholars now refer to as the prolonged phase. You'd try to pull away politely, not wanting to cause a scene in the middle of the cloister. But Brother Clement had the grip strength of a man who spent decades hauling buckets of holy water uphill. And the look on his face. It was the expression of someone absolutely certain this was part of God's plan, even though God, if asked directly, might have issued a polite no comment. The problem wasn't just the duration, it was the frequency. Brother Clement side-hugged everyone, novices, visiting pilgrims, delivery boys who brought bread from the village. If a stray cat wandered into the courtyard, you could bet it would be pinned against his side by lunchtime. Rumour had it that a bishop once came for an inspection and left 2 hours later with a slightly bent mitre from being caught in the embrace. And here's the thing, because Brother Clement framed it as a sign of spiritual brotherhood, no one could call him out without sounding like they were rejecting Christian fellowship. It was the perfect loophole. In a way, Brother Clement's side hug was an art form. He'd angle his body just so, making it impossible to escape without looking like you were shoving a monk. He'd start with a quick squeeze, just enough to suggest he might let go, then tighten ever so slightly, as if to say, "No, friend, the Holy Spirit hasn't finished moving through this moment yet." And before you knew it, you were standing there, trapped, wondering if your lunch break would be entirely consumed by this man's version of a benediction. By the time Brother Clement passed into legend, or at least into the monastery's list of quirky characters from our past, his side hug had become a local cautionary tale. The younger monks joked about it in whispers, warning each other to always keep an arm's length during Lent. But somewhere deep down, everyone knew the truth. Brother Clement's legacy wasn't in the scriptures he copied or the sermons he gave. It was in that awkward, unavoidable, eternally memorable moment when you realized that sometimes the most invasive thing in the world is also wearing a halo. There's something about holy relics that commands reverence. A saint's fingerbone, a sliver of the true cross, a robe worn during a miraculous event, all displayed under glass, lit by flickering candles, and guarded by someone who looks like they haven't smiled since the invention of bread. Pilgrims come from miles away, kneeling, whispering prayers, and leaving coins in the donation box. But every so often, you stumble upon a relic that makes you pause, tilt your head, and quietly think, "That's moving," and I don't mean emotionally. Enter the case of Father Bartholomew and the blessed arm of Saint Helmond. According to the plaque, this relic had been brought to the abbey centuries ago, carried by monks through storms, wars, and at least one suspicious kitchen fire. It was said to bring blessings to all who touched it. But here's the unsettling detail. The arm was soft. Not mummified, not preserved in resin, soft, like bread left out for half a day, and if you lingered too long in front of the display case, you might notice the faintest twitch. The official explanation was that the saint's holiness was so powerful it kept his relic alive in a spiritual sense. The unofficial explanation, whispered by visiting merchants who had accidentally caught the thing flexing, was that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an arm that had been in heaven for the last 600 years. Father Bartholomew didn't help matters. He had a way of presenting the relic that felt a little performative. Pilgrims would line up, eager for a blessing, and he'd bring out the arm with all the drama of a stage magician. He'd hold it high, let the candlelight glint off its pale surface, and then slowly, very slowly, press it to the forehead of the kneeling faithful. Sometimes, if you looked closely, his fingers would give the arm an encouraging squeeze, as though reminding it to play along. And people loved it. They swore they felt a warmth, a pulse, even a gentle pat. "The saint touched me," they'd whisper afterward, clutching their rosaries. And no one dared suggest that maybe what they felt was just Father Bartholomew's habit of holding on to blessings longer than socially necessary. The trouble came when a group of young novices got curious after evening prayer. One night, while Father Bartholomew was away visiting the bishop, they sneaked into the relic chamber to get a closer look. They returned pale, wide-eyed, and refusing to speak of what they'd seen. The only thing anyone could get out of them was a muttered, It made eye contact. The story spread fast, and from then on, even the most devout pilgrims approached the relic with a mix of awe and very polite fear. And yet the blessed arm of St. Helmond remained on display, still drawing crowds, still doing whatever it was doing, because in the world of spiritual devotion, questioning a miracle is far riskier than simply nodding, dropping a coin in the box, and pretending you didn't see it wave. Foot washing has been a respected spiritual practice for centuries. In many traditions, it's a sign of humility, service, and equality. A symbolic reminder that no one is above another in the eyes of the divine. When done correctly, it's a brief, meaningful ritual. But when done by Prophet Elias of the River Valley sect, it was something else. Officially, Elias claimed his lifelong mission was to cleanse the souls, to cleanse the soul. Unofficially, locals started referring to him as the basin enthusiast because he seemed just a little too eager to get those sandals off strangers. The ceremony always started innocently enough. Pilgrims would arrive at the small riverside gathering place, dusty and weary from travel. Elias, tall and thin, with the kind of gaze that made you feel like he was reading the titles of every book you'd ever borrowed but never returned, would greet them warmly. Then, without much of a pause, he'd gesture toward a row of wooden chairs and a large copper basin filled with warm water. "The cleansing begins now," he'd say, already kneeling, already reaching for their ankles. This speed was the first red flag. Normally, in most traditions, there's a bit of prayer before the act. Maybe a hymn, maybe a moment of reflection. Not here. Elias treated it like a competitive sport, as though each second that passed before your feet were submerged was a personal failing. Once the washing began, you quickly realized this was not a standard 3-minute rinse and dry. Elias took his time, his sweet, merciless time. Each toe got individual attention. He rotated feet like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem. He'd hum softly, not a hymn you recognized, just humming. The water was replaced frequently, which might have been a nice touch if it didn't mean he got to start the whole process over again. And the worst part? He made eye contact. Not casual. Yes, we're sharing a spiritual moment. Eye contact. This was the unblinking stare of a man deeply committed to the belief that the path to enlightenment ran directly through your arches. If someone tried to politely pull away, citing time or urgent bladder concerns, Elias would respond with a gentle but firm hand on their ankle and say, "The spirit has not yet been refreshed." No one knew how to counter that without sounding like they were rejecting holiness itself, so they'd sit there, awkwardly pretending to meditate, while Elias methodically wrung out a cloth over their toes like he was conducting a very personal baptism. The truly devout insisted that the prophet's touch brought healing, that the lingering tingling in their feet was divine energy flowing through them. The less devout whispered that it was just circulation returning after an unreasonably long soak. Either way, the ritual continued for years, drawing curious visitors and baffled onlookers. And even after Elias passed away, the sect kept a commemorative copper basin in the meeting hall. They no longer practiced the washing, but it stood there like a silent reminder. Spirituality is beautiful, but sometimes it gets a little too hands-on. A pilgrimage is supposed to be a sacred journey, a time for reflection, sacrifice, and quiet devotion. You pack light, walk far, and focus on the divine. That's the theory. But then there was the peculiar case of High Guide Maurentius and his extended spiritual tours, which the less charitable locals dubbed the world's longest honeymoon without a marriage license. Officially, Maurentius led groups of pious travellers to the great shrine of the ever-burning lamp, a destination so holy it was said the air itself shimmered with prayer. In practice, these pilgrimages took months longer than necessary, involved an alarming number of romantic sunset stops, and had more bonding exercises than a questionable summer camp. Maurentius himself was a tall man with an extravagant beard that seemed to have its own wind patterns. He claimed to have been personally called by the heavens to lead the faithful, but his interpretation of leading was unconventional. For one, his routes were suspiciously circuitous. Instead of taking the direct 3-week path to the shrine, he'd opt for the scenic detour through vineyards, flower fields and remote lake shores where the group would be encouraged to swim for purification. There was a lot of purification, and Laurentius always seemed to be on hand to personally supervise it, purely out of spiritual concern, of course. Evenings were no less odd. After long days of walking, instead of encouraging prayer or rest, he'd organize soul-bonding circles, where pilgrims were instructed to gaze deeply into one another's eyes while holding hands for a count of 30. Somehow, Laurentius always found a way to be in the middle of these circles, preferably between the two most hesitant participants. Eye contact, he explained, is the language of the divine. Critics noted that his definition of divine appeared to align suspiciously well with intimate. And the sleeping arrangements? Let's just say they raised eyebrows. Officially, pilgrims were assigned lodging according to availability. Unofficially, Laurentius seemed to have a system that resulted in him always sharing quarters with the most spiritually curious members of the group. When questioned about this, he'd give a knowing smile and say, "The road to the shrine is a road to knowing oneself and others." Despite these quirks, the journeys remained popular. Some swore the experience was transformative, that the slow pace and constant togetherness brought them closer to enlightenment. Others muttered that it brought them closer to heat rash and unwanted poetry readings. By the time they finally reached the shrine, the group was either bonded for life or desperately eager to part ways forever. And Laurentius? He'd wave them off with a dramatic blessing, then immediately start recruiting for the next trip. Because for him, the pilgrimage wasn't just about reaching a holy place. It was about making the journey last just long enough to blur the line between spiritual awakening and something you'd rather not explain to your spouse back home. In the grand tradition of ancient mystics, oracles were supposed to be mysterious, elusive figures, half in this world, half in the other. They spoke in riddles, sat in incense-filled chambers, and occasionally collapsed into dramatic trances for added effect. But then there was Delphinia of the wind-touched veil, a prophetess whose visions were less about reading the stars and more about running her fingers through the hair of anyone who came too close. To her followers, she was the hand of destiny. To everyone else, she was that oracle who will absolutely touch your head without asking. The setup was always the same. You'd enter her small, dimly lit shrine carrying a question in your heart and an offering in your hands. Delphinia would sit cross-legged on a cushion, her silver hair draped over her shoulders like she'd just walked out of a shampoo commercial. She'd listen intently as you explained your dilemma, whether it was about love, harvest, or mysterious goat disappearances. Then, without warning, she'd lean forward, place both hands on your head, and start rearranging your hair as though she were auditioning to be the village barber. And this wasn't a quick, symbolic gesture. No, Delphinia had technique. She'd part your hair, twist a strand, tuck something behind your ear, and occasionally braid a section while muttering about omens. The longer you sat there, the more elaborate the styling became. One man claimed he came in asking about his financial troubles and left with a full fishtail braid and absolutely no idea what she'd said in between the combing motions. Her reasoning was simple, at least according to her. Hair, she explained, was the antenna of the soul. The longer she touched it, the clearer the signal from the gods became. Skeptics pointed out that this conveniently meant every reading had to be accompanied by prolonged head contact. Believers, on the other hand, claimed they felt lighter, calmer, and oddly well-groomed afterward. Of course, her habit led to some memorable incidents. One merchant with a shaved head reported that she sat in awkward silence for a full 5 minutes, lightly patting his scalp while staring off into the middle distance. A visiting dignitary with a towering ceremonial headdress had to be gently pried from her grip by his guards when she tried to free the hair beneath the crown. And let's not forget the time she attempted to read an elderly nun whose hair was entirely covered by a wimple. Delphinia, unfazed, simply placed her hands on the fabric and began massaging the cloth like it was a stress ball. Whether her prophecies were accurate was almost beside the point. People kept coming back, if only to see what their hair might look like afterward. And somewhere, in the strange intersection of personal space and divine revelation, Delphinia sat in her shrine, ready to welcome the next seeker. and their unsuspecting scalp. Holy water, in its purest form, is meant to bless, purify, and protect. A few drops on the forehead, a sprinkle at a doorway, maybe a discreet sip during a particularly tense family dinner. But in the coastal city of Moravia, a certain order of monks decided that a sprinkle was simply not enough. They built what they proudly called the Great Bath of Benediction, which in practice was less of a solemn spiritual site and more of a spa with delusions of grandeur. Officially, the bathhouse was designed for full-body purification before major religious festivals. Unofficially, it became the go-to place for Moravia's most eccentric faithful to spend 3 hours floating around while monks hovered nearby with ladles offering top-ups. The building itself was impressive. Marble floors, columns carved with scenes of saints and angels, a massive central pool that steamed gently in the sunlight. At first glance, you might believe you were entering a place of high sanctity. Then you'd notice the suspicious number of lounging benches, the faint scent of exotic oils, and the large sign that read, "Please disrobe before entering. The spirit must be bare to receive the blessing." According to the monks, this was purely symbolic, a stripping away of earthly attachments. According to everyone else, it was a bit too symbolic. Once inside, the purification process began. You'd be guided to the edge of the pool, where a monk with the energy of a very determined lifeguard would hand you a clay cup of pre-blessing water to sip. Then you'd wade into the pool, where the water was so warm it felt like you were melting into a divine broth. The monks would circulate among the bathers, ladling water over their heads while reciting prayers. And while that sounds harmless enough, the ladling was thorough, very thorough. They'd pour water over your shoulders, down your back, over your arms, and just when you thought they were finished, they'd return with a new ladle and a mysterious smile. Some claimed the monks' commitment to covering every inch of the vessel, meaning you, was part of a centuries-old rite. Others suspected that perhaps over time the line between sacred duty and intrusive hospitality had blurred. The bathhouse became infamous for attracting certain personalities who didn't seem particularly interested in the religious side of things but were very committed to attending blessing hours twice a week. The city eventually stepped in, insisting that perhaps holy water ceremonies should not require a 3-hour soak followed by a communal nap on heated stone slabs. The monks, undeterred, simply rebranded the place as a meditation pool and continued business as usual, claiming that true spiritual purity could only be achieved when the body was as relaxed as a damp sponge. Whether they were right or wrong is still debated, but one thing's certain, no one left the Great Bath of Benediction feeling tense or dry. Most spiritual leaders preach about detachment from material possessions. Give up your gold, let go of envy, don't waste your life collecting decorative spoons. But Guru Pravan of the Mountain Path sect took this concept to its most literal and least comfortable extreme. According to him, all material possessions, including the fabric wrapped around your body, were anchors to the physical world and therefore a distraction from enlightenment, which is how he ended up leading what was essentially the world's most awkward monastery, a community of people who believed that in order to be spiritually free, one must be perpetually breezy. The mountaintop ashram where Pravan lived was beautiful. Terraced gardens, stone meditation halls, the crisp scent of pine drifting through the air. But the moment you arrived, you were gently informed by a smiling disciple that the journey to truth begins with shedding. Before you could ask what that meant, they'd hand you a folded cloth that was more suggestion than garment, and gesture toward the Hall of Liberation, where Pravan would be waiting. And waiting he was, usually seated cross-legged on a woven mat, utterly unbothered by the thin mountain air, beaming like the world's most overconfident sun god. The body is but a vessel, he'd say, and clothes are its unnecessary wrapping. This would be followed by a speech about how fabric created false boundaries between people, preventing the flow of cosmic energy. He would then invite newcomers to join the flow, which was his very poetic way of saying, remove your last layer of modesty and have a seat. Daily life in the ashram was a mix of meditation, yoga, communal meals, and pretending you were making eye contact during conversations. Pravan claimed that without clothes, people became more honest, more open, and more spiritually attuned. In reality, most visitors became more sunburned, and while some claimed to feel liberated, others reported that it was hard to focus on enlightenment when you were constantly wondering where to put your hands. Of course, Pravan led by example, drifting through the compound with the serene confidence of someone who'd never known the horror of sitting on a cold stone bench without warning. He often held truth circles, where followers would sit together, sharing their feelings while he offered guidance. The sessions were, by all accounts, intimate in every possible sense. Critics argued that his approach blurred the line between spiritual freedom and personal space invasion, but Pravan insisted it was all part of living without shame. When the authorities eventually visited, prompted by complaints from hikers who'd accidentally stumbled into a sunrise meditation, Pravan simply explained that his teachings were ancient, pure, and entirely voluntary. Technically, he was right. And so, the Mountain Path sect continued, high above the world, where the wind was cold, the pine trees swayed, and not a single scarf could be found. Confession, in its ideal form, is a solemn private act. You step into the booth, kneel in the dim light, and speak your sins in hushed tones to a figure hidden behind a wooden screen. You leave lighter, forgiven, maybe even motivated to live a better life. But in the small riverside town of Bellevere, the confessional experience took a turn when Father Lucien took over the parish. By all outward appearances, Father Lucien was a model priest, eloquent sermons, immaculate robes, and a smile that looked suspiciously like it had been practiced in a mirror. But his approach to confession was unconventional. Locals began quietly referring to the booth as the parish pickup box. For starters, Father Lucien was unusually chatty for a confessor. Instead of the usual pattern, sinner speaks, priest listens, priest offers penance, he liked to ask questions, many questions. Questions that had nothing to do with morality or repentance. You'd be midway through explaining how you'd gossiped about your neighbour's goat when he'd interrupt to ask, "And what colour is your hair naturally?" Or, "Would you say your eyes are more green or hazel in the morning light?" At first, people assumed this was some sort of new spiritual exercise. It wasn't. Then came the compliments. Father Lucien had a habit of responding to sins with observations like, "Well, pride is certainly a sin, but with cheekbones like yours, who could blame you?" Or, "You should be kinder to yourself. Your smile could light up the nave." Some penitents found this charming. Others left the booth blushing and clutching their rosaries like shields. It didn't help that Lucien seemed to remember details from previous confessions with uncanny precision, often referencing them as though continuing a very personal conversation. His most notorious habit, however, was the extended penance chat. Traditionally, once you've been given your penance, you're free to leave, but Father Lucien preferred to linger. "Let's just sit a moment," he'd say, his voice dripping with faux innocence. Silence is also a prayer. Then he'd proceed to fill that silence with casual questions about your hobbies, travel plans, and what you look for in a good parish community. The line outside would grow restless, but inside, time seemed to stretch indefinitely. Rumours began to circulate. Some whispered that Lucien was looking for a special someone under the guise of spiritual counsel, while others argued he was just an overly friendly extrovert in a profession built on restraint. Whatever the truth, the number of people attending confession spiked dramatically during his first year, particularly among certain demographics. Eventually, the bishop paid a visit. Whether a formal warning was given is unknown, but Father Lucien's sessions became shorter afterward, though he still found ways to slip in a compliment or two. And so, the people of Bellevere returned to their sins, safe in the knowledge that if they ever needed both absolution and an oddly specific comment about their hair, the booth was always open. For many spiritual traditions, celibacy is a vow as sacred as it is difficult, a commitment to direct all one's energy toward the divine, free from earthly attachments. It's not meant to be easy, but it is meant to be clear. In the hilltop monastery of San Viaggio, however, one particular friar seemed to interpret celibacy as more of a flexible guideline than an unshakable promise. His name was Brother Alfeo. and he had mastered the art of towing the line between piety and outright scandal with the precision of a tightrope walker who's also holding a wine glass. Alfeo had a disarming charm that worked on nearly everyone: villagers, pilgrims, even the abbess of a nearby convent who was famously immune to flattery. His deep, melodic voice made even the driest readings of scripture sound like romantic poetry, and he had an uncanny ability to appear exactly where you didn't expect him: in the cloister garden when you went for a solitary walk, by the church door when you left evening prayer, or at the bakery just as you were buying bread. He always seemed to be coincidentally present, ready to offer a blessing that lingered just a little too long. His defense was simple. The vow of celibacy, he claimed, was about refraining from certain acts, the technical kind. As long as he avoided those, he argued, everything else was fair game. This loophole thinking led to an alarming number of holy embraces and comforting touches that made some visitors wonder if the line between the sacred and the suggestive had simply been erased. During confession, he was known to lean in so close that penitents had to back away just to breathe. At community feasts, he would sit beside the same person all evening, refilling their cup every time they took a sip, an act he framed as serving in the spirit of Christ, but which somehow always ended with a shared plate of figs and a lot of eye contact. Naturally, rumours began to swirl. Some said Alfeo had a special ministry that only certain parishioners experienced. Others joked that he had taken a vow of selective celibacy, abstaining from some things, indulging in others. The abbot, concerned about appearances, called him in for a talk. No one knows exactly what was said, but afterward Alfeo began prefacing every interaction with the words, "As your brother in Christ," as though that made the rest of the encounter automatically holy. Despite the whispers, Brother Alfeo remained popular. Pilgrims still lined up for his blessings, and the monastery kept receiving generous donations from unexpected sources. Whether it was his charisma, his bending of the rules, or simply the fact that he made people feel noticed, he never lacked company. And perhaps that was the real lesson of San Viaggio. Vows are only as strict as the person keeping them. And as long as you say, "God bless you," at the end, some people will forgive almost anything. Meditation retreats are supposed to be about silence. You arrive, hand over your phone, and enter a realm where the loudest sound you hear all day is the creak of your own knees during sunrise yoga. The idea is to detach from worldly distractions and immerse yourself in the stillness of your own mind. But if you signed up for Master Jinto's 7-day Silent Soul Retreat, you quickly discovered that silence was optional, romance was encouraged, and enlightenment came with a side of awkward small talk. Master Jinto was a wiry man in his 70s with the posture of a bamboo pole and the perpetual smile of someone who knew your secrets before you did. His teachings were a blend of Zen philosophy, folk superstition, and what he liked to call soul pairing. The official retreat schedule included meditation sessions, nature walks, and silent communal meals. Unofficially, these activities were arranged in ways that suspiciously resembled speed dating, if speed dating involved more sitting cross-legged and fewer cocktails. On the first morning, participants would be paired off for eye-gazing meditations, which Jinto insisted were vital for seeing the soul beyond the body. You'd be assigned a partner, always of the gender and approximate age range you might be interested in, and told to maintain uninterrupted eye contact for 5 minutes. Those who tried to look away were gently reminded that the eyes are the mirrors of the eternal. Those who didn't try to look away often left the session with the beginnings of what the retreat brochure did not call a holiday romance. Meals were no better. Though officially silent, Jinto had a habit of seating participants beside the same person for every meal, often placing a single candle between them for focus. If the person across from you happened to be attractive, you'd spend the meal pretending to contemplate impermanence while actually thinking about how nice their smile looked in candlelight. If they weren't your type, well, impermanence became easier to meditate on. Even the nature walks were designed with pairing in mind. Participants were instructed to walk 2 by 2, matching breath and step with their partner. Jinto explained that syncing your rhythm with another's brought cosmic harmony. In practice, it brought a lot of blushing, hand brushes, and at least one couple who disappeared into the bamboo grove and missed the rest of the day's sessions. When asked about this unusual approach, Jinto simply smiled and said, "The heart and the soul are not separate. If the heart opens, the soul follows." Whether this was deep wisdom or just a clever marketing line was up for debate, but one thing was certain. People left the retreat with more than they came for. Some returned to their daily lives feeling spiritually renewed. Others returned with phone numbers. And a few returned with the awkward task of explaining to their spouses why they were suddenly very interested in weekend meditation trips. Some spiritual leaders embrace celibacy as a noble choice, a sacrifice for the sake of their calling. Others accept it as part of the job, even if it's not their favourite rule. And then there was Leader Varin of the Radiant Path Fellowship, a man who publicly praised the virtues of solitary devotion while privately acting like he was just waiting for divine permission to start dating again. In theory, Varin's position demanded strict romantic abstinence. In practice, his sermons sounded less like passionate vows of chastity and more like the grumblings of a man convinced the universe had set an unfair personal boundary. The Radiant Path Fellowship was a small but fervent group tucked away in the foothills. Members believed in simplicity, kindness, and the pursuit of pure light. They also believed their leader was the perfect example of this way of life, at least at first. Varin certainly looked the part. Flowing robes, wise eyes, and a voice so calm it could make a thunderstorm feel insecure. But if you listened closely to his teachings, certain patterns emerged. His lectures on detachment often drifted into wistful anecdotes about companionship and partnerships of the soul. He'd speak longingly about the joys of walking hand in hand with another, strictly in a spiritual sense, he'd add quickly, before launching into a story about a widow he once counselled for 3 hours straight. Group meals were where his reluctance became most obvious. Tradition dictated that the leader sat at the head of the table, but Varin had a habit of shifting his seat so that he could be beside whichever new member had recently joined. He claimed this was to make them feel welcome, though his definition of welcome seemed to involve a lot of warm smiles, soft touches on the shoulder, and asking personal questions that had little to do with spiritual matters. Even the community's daily meditation sessions weren't immune. Members would sit in a circle, eyes closed, breathing in unison. Inevitably, Varin would suggest a partnered meditation exercise for energy alignment. This usually meant pairing himself with someone he described as in need of extra guidance. Observers noticed that extra guidance often correlated suspiciously with new arrival and good hair. The fellowship tolerated his quirks partly because he was undeniably good at his job. Donations were steady, attendance was growing, and visitors often left feeling both spiritually inspired and oddly flattered. But the older members whispered that Varin's singlehood wasn't so much a chosen path as an ongoing disappointment. If he could get away with it, one elder confided, he'd be married tomorrow. Twice. For now, Varin remained officially unattached, still delivering sermons on the bliss of spiritual solitude, still sighing just a little too loudly when talking about love, and still finding reasons to schedule one-on-one guidance sessions that ran far longer than the posted times. Whether this was a moral failing or just a very human longing, no one could say for sure. But it was clear to everyone in the Radiant Path Fellowship. Their leader was single by rule, not by choice, and he was hoping the rule might change any day now. Monastic life is traditionally built on discipline, structure, and a carefully maintained distance from earthly indulgences. Silence, fasting, and long hours of meditation are the cornerstones of a monk's day. But Brother Caldus of the Abbey of Gentle Light decided that what the spiritual world really needed was more hugging. In his mind, physical closeness was not just acceptable, it was necessary. Thus was born his highly questionable innovation, cuddle prayer. The concept, as Caldus explained, came to him in a dream in which he was embraced by what he described as a warm beam of divine love. Upon waking, he concluded that God was telling him to bring people together physically while praying. And so, the abbey's normal prayer circles, where monks sat neatly spaced with hands folded, were replaced by what could only be described as holy huddles. Caldus would instruct participants to sit as close as possible, knees touching, arms wrapped around one another, and begin reciting prayers in unison. If the group was small, it looked like a cozy campfire gathering. If the group was large, it resembled a rugby scrum reciting scripture. Caldus insisted that this practice broke down barriers between individuals and allowed the Holy Spirit to flow like warmth between hearts. The less convinced pointed out that it also broke down personal space and the Abbey's previously excellent hygiene record. During winter, the sessions had some appeal. Nothing took the edge off a drafty stone chapel like being pressed against your fellow worshippers for 40 minutes straight. In summer, however, it was less divine warmth and more a trial by collective perspiration. Visitors to the Abbey often didn't know what they were walking into. Many arrived expecting quiet contemplation and instead found themselves wrapped in the arms of a stranger before they'd even removed their cloaks. Caldus was always in the centre of the group, arms open wide, drawing people in with the fervour of a man on a personal mission. He claimed he could feel spiritual knots in people's backs, and often paused mid-prayer to give them a squeeze for release. While some left the experience glowing with affection, others left wondering whether they'd just attended a worship service or an extremely committed cuddle club. The other monks were divided. Some embraced, literally and figuratively, the new practice, enjoying the sense of unity it fostered. Others grumbled that it distracted from true meditation and blurred the line between spiritual and social intimacy. But Caldus was undeterred. He began offering cuddle prayer workshops to other monasteries, travelling with the enthusiasm of a man convinced he was changing the world one group hug at a time. And so, in the Abbey of Gentle Light, the tradition endured. Twice daily, the bells rang, the monks gathered, and the faithful squeezed themselves into one warm, breathing mass. Whether it brought them closer to God or just to each other remained an open question, but no one could deny it brought them close. Prophets, in the public imagination, are lofty figures, visionaries who speak with the voice of the divine, untouchable and above the petty desires of ordinary people. But Prophet Malvian of the Rose Dawn sect shattered that image in the most peculiar way, by insisting that part of his holy mission was to receive what he called sacred kisses from his followers. According to him, each kiss was a symbolic sealing of prayer, a ritual exchange of breath that carried the devotee's intentions directly to the heavens. According to everyone else, it was just kissing. The Rose Dawn sect was a small but passionate movement, with followers drawn to its poetic teachings and elaborate dawn ceremonies. Malvian himself had an undeniable stage presence, tall, handsome, with eyes that seemed to smoulder even when he was talking about crop yields. During gatherings, he would stand before the crowd, arms outstretched, and invite anyone wishing to seal their prayer to step forward. One by one, they'd approach, bow their heads, and place a kiss, sometimes on his hand, sometimes on his cheek, and, in cases he deemed especially spiritually fervent, directly on the lips. Malvian claimed the location of the kiss was divinely guided. Skeptics noticed that divine guidance seemed remarkably consistent with personal preference. The ritual soon became the highlight of every service, drawing large crowds eager to see who would be chosen for a full blessing. Some treated it like a spiritual honor, others treated it like a strange lottery they were determined to win. He even created a kiss ledger, a beautifully bound book in which he recorded each sacred kiss, date, name, and a short note about the prayer it accompanied. For instance, April 3rd, Sister Elara, praying for her son's safe return, or May 17th, Brother Lucent, praying for good harvest, exceptionally warm exchange. The ledger was kept in a locked chest, though not so locked that Malvian couldn't dramatically retrieve it during ceremonies to read selected notable kisses aloud. Not everyone was charmed. A few members quietly left the sect, uncomfortable with the increasingly intimate nature of the blessings. Rumours spread that Malvian was offering private, extended kiss sessions in his chambers, framed as deep spiritual counselling. When confronted, he brushed it off with a knowing smile and said, "The lips speak truths the tongue cannot utter." No one was entirely sure what that meant, but it sounded enough like scripture to deflect serious questions. Still, his popularity persisted. Many followers swore they felt an undeniable energy during the ritual, a warmth, a closeness, a feeling of being seen. Others suspected the warmth had less to do with divine power and more to do with the fact that Malvian was simply very good at making people feel special. And so the Rose Dawn sect continued its dawn gatherings, its prayers, and its peculiar tradition of sealing devotion with a kiss, sacred or otherwise. Ascetics are usually famous for avoiding comfort. They sleep on hard floors, eat bland food, and sometimes spend years alone in caves just to prove they've conquered physical desire. But Saint, or perhaps self-appointed saint, Ravallo had a different approach. He claimed that true healing, both spiritual and physical, could only occur through what he called skin-to-skin contact. To hear him explain it, this wasn't about pleasure, it was about energy transfer, divine warmth, and removing the barriers between souls. To hear his critics explain it, it was about as spiritual as an overly friendly massage therapist. Ravallo lived in a simple hut on the edge of a mountain village where pilgrims came seeking wisdom and increasingly his so-called healing sessions. The process began with him greeting you at the door, usually barefoot and wrapped in nothing but a loose linen cloth that looked one stiff breeze away from betrayal. After a short conversation about your troubles, illness, grief, anxiety, he would nod gravely and say, "Yes, this requires full alignment." That was your cue to follow him into a dim room with a mat in the center. You'd then be instructed to remove any energy-blocking fabrics, also known as your clothes, and lie down. Ravallo would do the same, explaining that equal exposure was vital for the ritual to work. He would then press his body against yours in various configurations, sometimes back-to-back, sometimes face-to-face, while humming low, drawn-out chants. The idea, he said, was that his body heat carried divine energy into yours, burning away sickness and sorrow. The reality, for most people, was an overwhelming sense of, "I'm not sure this is in the scriptures." The sessions could last anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour, depending on what Ravallo described as the depth of your blockages. Many pilgrims swore they felt lighter afterward, even euphoric. Others left with a vague sense of having been spiritually pickpocketed. Word spread quickly, and soon his hut was seeing a steady stream of visitors, some seeking miraculous cures, others just curious about the infamous healer. Naturally, not everyone approved. The village priest openly called Ravallo's methods suspiciously warm and warned the faithful to stick with traditional blessings. Ravallo responded by claiming the priest was afraid of true intimacy with the divine. This only fueled the mystique, and his following grew. Soon he was offering group alignment ceremonies, where multiple people would lie in a human chain, all pressed together in a tangle of limbs and linen. Whether or not anyone was actually healed remained debatable. What was certain was that Ravallo had created a practice that blurred the line between devotion and discomfort, between genuine compassion and something much more personal. But as long as people kept walking up the mountain and leaving with a story to tell, the skin-to-skin healer of the highlands remained a permanent, if slightly sweaty, fixture of the spiritual landscape. Hermits are usually defined by their absence. They live far away, speak rarely, and avoid human contact like it's a noisy dinner party they can't leave fast enough. But Hermit Solvan was not that kind of hermit. Oh, he lived alone in a crumbling stone hut at the edge of the forest. And yes, he grew a beard that could have doubled as a small ecosystem. But unlike other reclusive holy men, Solvan had a curious habit of making house calls, specifically between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning. These visits, he claimed, were to deliver his special midnight blessings. According to Solvan, the world was quietest at night, when the veil between the earthly and the divine was at its thinnest. This, he insisted, was the perfect time to share blessings of protection, healing, and, though he never put it quite this way, lingering personal attention. Villagers would awaken to find Solvan at their bedside, silhouetted in candlelight, murmuring prayers in his gravelly voice. For some it was an oddly comforting experience. For others it was just terrifying. The The ritual was always the same. Solvan would place a hand, sometimes on the forehead, sometimes on the chest, sometimes in a location that made recipients question his understanding of anatomy, and begin a whispered incantation. Then he would lean very close, so close that the blessing felt more like a secret being breathed directly into your skin. He claimed this intimacy was necessary to transfer warmth from soul to soul, a phrase that did nothing to put suspicious minds at ease. Occasionally, he would ask to sit on the edge of the bed and hold the person's hand until the blessing took root. These hand-holding sessions could stretch on for several minutes, with Solvan nodding solemnly as though tracking invisible progress. Some villagers admitted they would fake sleep during the entire thing, partly to avoid conversation, and partly because they weren't sure what etiquette applied when a forest hermit was kneeling at your bedside at 1 a.m. His midnight blessings became so well known that a few people actually began leaving their doors unlocked, hoping for a visit. Others installed extra locks. Children whispered about the night monk, while certain widows became particularly enthusiastic about receiving his spiritual services. Rumours swirled, but Solvan insisted his work was entirely pure. The night, he would say, is when the soul listens best. No one ever managed to catch him in the act of doing anything strictly improper, though his timing and methods left plenty of room for raised eyebrows. And so Solvan continued his nocturnal rounds, lantern in hand, a shadow moving from house to house under the cover of darkness. Whether he was a devoted holy man or just someone with an unusually personal definition of blessing, no one could quite agree. But one thing was certain: in that village, if you woke in the middle of the night and saw a flicker of candlelight in your doorway, you knew the hermit had come calling. Visionaries often receive their divine messages in public, standing before crowds, bathed in sunlight, eyes turned skyward as they declare what the heavens have told them. But visionary Marel of the Temple of the New Horizon claimed that true revelations were delicate things, far too fragile for noisy gatherings. According to him, the divine spoke most clearly in seclusion, preferably in a small, dimly lit chamber where he could be alone with the chosen recipient. Thus, the temple's most whispered-about feature was born: the private revelation rooms. These rooms, as Marel described them, were sanctuaries where distractions fell away, leaving only the presence of the prophet, the follower, and the whisper of divine truth. In reality, they were little more than closets with thick curtains, a single cushion, and an atmosphere that felt more like a secret rendezvous than a holy encounter. Only one follower at a time was allowed inside, and once the curtain was drawn, no one could see or hear what passed between them. The process was elaborate. First, Morel would announce that he had received a stirring in the spirit about a particular person. He would then invite them, in a voice just loud enough for the entire assembly to hear, to join him in the revelation chamber. The chosen follower would step inside, where Morel would sit very close, gaze into their eyes, and begin speaking in slow, rhythmic tones about visions of their future. Somewhere along the way, these visions often required physical contact: a hand on the knee to steady the soul, a palm against the cheek to guide the mind, or, in more intense revelations, both hands firmly holding the follower's face while Morel's breath mingled with theirs. Many emerged from the chamber glowing, claiming they had felt an overwhelming peace or a rush of clarity. Others emerged looking confused, as if they weren't entirely sure whether they'd had a spiritual awakening or just an oddly personal conversation in the dark. Still, the ritual became the highlight of temple gatherings. People began dressing carefully in hopes of being chosen, while those passed over would sit quietly, half relieved and half disappointed. Over time, the temple elders started to express concern. Not about the content of the revelations, no one knew what was said inside after all, but about the optics. They suggested Morel consider offering public visions again, perhaps on the main dais. He refused, saying the divine would be offended by such an undignified display. And so the curtains remained drawn, the rooms remained dim, and the revelations remained very private. Whether Morel truly channeled divine truth or simply enjoyed the soft lighting and proximity, no one could say for certain, but the private revelation rooms endured, and followers kept lining up outside them, waiting for their turn to step into the hush, the dimness, and the gaze of the man who claimed to see their souls from very, very close. Pilgrimages are meant to be journeys of endurance, dusty roads, aching feet, and long hours of quiet contemplation. The hardship is part of the purification, or so most guides will tell you. But not Brother Halric. Halric led groups along the ancient stoneway path to the shrine of the Morning Star, and while his routes were standard, his methods were innovative. He believed the journey wasn't just about walking to a sacred site, it was about releasing tensions of the flesh so the spirit could travel freely. His preferred method of doing this, something he called the spiritual massage. Halric introduced the practice casually, usually around the second day of the pilgrimage when blisters had formed and spirits had started to flag. He'd announced during rest breaks that the group needed to realign the body's channels before continuing. Then, with a blanket spread on the grass, he'd invite one pilgrim at a time to lie down. The massage would begin with Halric's palms pressed lightly on their shoulders, accompanied by a murmured blessing. So far, so harmless. But then his hands would begin to wander, tracing along arms, down spines, pressing into hips, all while he insisted this was necessary to loosen the soul's knots. Halric claimed to have learned the technique from an elderly monk in the eastern mountains, though his description of the training sounded suspiciously like a story designed to make the whole thing seem more legitimate. The sessions often lasted well beyond what was strictly necessary for tired muscles. Other pilgrims, sitting nearby, would shift uncomfortably as they waited for their turn, some eager, others clearly praying to be skipped. By the third day of the journey, the massages had become a fixture of the pilgrimage. Morning stretches were followed by alignment work, midday rests by spirit loosening, and evening campfires often ended with one or two people lying under Halric's care while the rest of the group looked anywhere but at the blanket. A few pilgrims swore they felt truly renewed afterward, as if the aches of the road had melted away. Others confessed in hushed tones that they felt more awkward than enlightened. The shrine authorities eventually caught wind of the practice when multiple groups led by Halric began arriving noticeably later than scheduled, citing extended energy work as the reason. A quiet investigation followed, but Halric defended his methods passionately, insisting they were part of a sacred tradition, and, conveniently, many of his past pilgrims vouched for the transformative nature of his touch. In the end, the shrine let him continue, albeit with a gentle reminder to keep the focus on the journey, not the body. Halric nodded solemnly and immediately began advertising his next pilgrimage as the path to the Morning Star with full spiritual realignment. And so each new group set out with him, unaware that somewhere between mile 4 and mile 5 they'd be introduced to the warm, lingering hands of the man who believed enlightenment could be kneaded into the muscles. Nuns are often imagined as paragons of discipline, eyes lowered, voices soft, and thoughts fixed firmly on the divine. Sister Merelda of the Convent of the Shining Heart certainly dressed the part, with her immaculate habit and polished rosary beads, but behind the serene smile was a woman who had turned conversation into an art form so charged with personal attention that some called it holy flirtation. Merelda never admitted this, of course. She simply insisted she had the gift of making others feel deeply valued. Her approach was subtle. She would begin by locking eyes with you just a fraction longer than politeness required. Then came the questions, not the polite, distant sort, but ones that probed into your life with almost alarming tenderness. "Do you sleep well at night?" she might ask, leaning in slightly. "You seem like someone who dreams often." Compliments flowed naturally from her lips, wrapped in spiritual language. "Your voice," she would murmur, "has a softness that must please the Lord." Or, "There's a kindness in your eyes that could heal wounds." During confession, she had a way of listening that made penitents forget they were in a small wooden booth. Her responses were often accompanied by a hand slipping through the grate to rest gently on yours. "For comfort," she'd say. If the conversation turned emotional, she would tilt her head just so, a sympathetic smile curving her lips, and sigh as though carrying part of your burden herself. Many left feeling lighter. A few left feeling conflicted. Even routine tasks took on this quality. Distributing bread to the poor, Merelda would let her fingers brush over each hand a second longer than necessary. At prayer gatherings, she often chose to sit beside newcomers, murmuring guidance into their ear in a tone so warm it made others glance over. She called it bringing people into the fold. Others called it getting remarkably close for a vow of chastity. Word of her holy flirtation spread beyond the convent walls, and soon there were more visitors than usual at Sunday Mass. Some genuinely sought spiritual guidance. Others came out of curiosity, or perhaps hope, to see whether Sister Merelda's attention would fall on them. The abbess, while aware of the rumours, never publicly reprimanded her. After all, attendance and donations had risen, and no one could accuse Merelda of breaking any explicit rules. Still, whispers persisted. Some said she had favourites who received extra time in the garden with her, or more personal letters of encouragement. Merelda simply smiled at such talk and reminded everyone that love, in all its forms, brings us closer to God. Whether her love was purely spiritual or something softer, warmer, and more human was a matter of interpretation, and Sister Merelda was in no hurry to clear that up. Most gurus point to the divine. Guru Anavar pointed to himself, and with no shortage of confidence. He was the founder of the Temple of Harmonious Joy, a community that blended meditation, music, and a philosophy he summed up in one unforgettable line: "The body is the doorway, and I am the key." According to Anavar, enlightenment could not be reached through denial or austerity, but through pleasure, preferably pleasure facilitated directly by him. The temple itself looked innocent enough, with whitewashed walls, gardens full of sweet-smelling flowers, and a great domed hall where gatherings took place. But the moment a newcomer arrived, they were met with Anavar's personal, welcoming ritual. He would approach slowly, barefoot and draped in silken robes, fix them with an intense gaze and say, "I see a shadow in you. Let me show you the light." From there, the conversation could quickly turn to his favourite subject: how spiritual growth and physical ecstasy were two sides of the same coin. His teachings were a patchwork of half-remembered Eastern philosophies, sensual poetry, and metaphors that somehow always circled back to the importance of shared experiences. During evening meditations, Anavar would move silently among the followers, placing a hand on a shoulder here, a gentle touch along a spine there, pausing beside those he deemed receptive to the energy. He often invited individuals to private pleasure meditations, explaining that true release of worldly burdens required a guide unafraid of intimacy. The sessions, according to those who participated, began with breathing exercises and soft music, and ended somewhere far beyond the usual boundaries of spiritual mentorship. Some left feeling transformed, convinced they had touched the divine through Anavar's guidance. Others left with the uneasy realization that the experience had been more about Anavar's personal satisfaction than their enlightenment. His inner circle defended him fiercely, describing him as a man wholly devoted to breaking down the false divide between body and spirit. Critics called him a manipulator draping indulgence in the language of mysticism. But Anavar was a master of image. He kept the gardens blooming, the music playing, and the air in the temple thick with incense. He gave talks that were equal parts sermon and seduction, his voice slow and hypnotic, his words painting a picture of a spiritual path paved with rose petals and whispered promises. Despite murmurs of disapproval from other spiritual leaders, his community continued to grow. Visitors came from far away to hear the man who claimed to be both the road and the destination, and many stayed longer than they planned. Whether they found enlightenment or simply found themselves caught in the gravitational pull of a man who could make pleasure sound holy, only they could say. But for Anavar, the formula was simple. The body was sacred, joy was divine, and he was, unquestionably, the path to both. In most traditions, blessings are given with words, gestures, or perhaps a sprinkle of water on the forehead. Mystic Dervana of the Sanctuary of Still Waters, however, took a more immersive approach, literally. She believed that blessings were most powerful when the recipient was fully submerged in water, preferably in her personal company. This was the origin of her signature ritual, the bath of blessing. The sanctuary sat beside a clear, spring-fed pool surrounded by smooth stones and hanging lanterns. To the casual observer, it was a peaceful place for reflection. To Dervana's followers, it was a sacred space where worldly burdens could be washed away. According to her, the pool had been shown to her in a vision, its waters carrying a memory of purity that could erase spiritual stains. But the water alone, she insisted, wasn't enough. It needed her touch, her guidance, and her whispered invocations to activate its divine potential. The process began with Dervana leading the chosen participant to the pool at twilight. She favoured twilight because, she said, the sun's last light makes the soul more open. Participants were instructed to remove all barriers, a phrase that conveniently included clothing, so they could enter the water unshielded. Dervana would then wade in alongside them, moving with slow, deliberate steps as she murmured prayers. Once the participant was waist-deep, she would place her hands on their shoulders, pressing gently but firmly, guiding them lower into the water until it covered their heart. She would then circle them slowly, her fingers skimming across their arms, back, and occasionally their face, to brush away lingering darkness. Sometimes she would pause behind them, resting her hands on their hips or lower back to center their energy. The ritual always ended with a final submersion, after which she would lift their chin and declare them cleansed, renewed, and reborn. Many describe the baths of blessing as profoundly moving. They spoke of feeling a deep peace settle over them, a sense of being fully known and fully accepted. Others, however, found the experience unsettling, especially the moments when Dervana's hands lingered in places that felt more personal than purifying. But questioning her methods was difficult, as she wrapped every gesture in a thick layer of spiritual language. The baths became the sanctuary's most sought-after ritual, drawing pilgrims from far-off towns. Donations swelled, and so did Dervana's reputation. Her followers defended her fiercely, pointing to the serene smiles of those who emerged from the water. Detractors muttered about boundaries and propriety, but their voices were drowned out by the steady splash of the next blessing beginning. And so, under the soft glow of lantern light, the baths of blessing continued. A ritual where the line between spiritual cleansing and something far more earthly was as fluid as the water itself. Confession is supposed to be a solemn affair. The penitent speaks, the priest listens, and absolution is granted through quiet words and a sign of the cross. Father Belleran of St. Miriath's parish believed this model was outdated. In his view, people could not truly open their hearts unless they felt physically and emotionally comforted. His solution was to transform confession from a brief exchange into what he called the ministry of embrace. The confessional booth was the first thing to go. Belleran replaced it with a small parlour draped in heavy curtains, furnished with a plush love seat and warmed by a constantly burning fire. The penitent would be invited to sit beside him, never across, so they could share the same space of the spirit. Once the person began to speak, Belleran would listen intently, nodding, sometimes closing his eyes as if absorbing their sorrow. At moments of heightened emotion, he would reach out and take their hands or drape an arm lightly over their shoulders, murmuring, "It's all right. You are safe here." If tears came, he would draw them into a gentle hug, holding them for as long as they needed. According to him, this closeness was vital to melting the ice around the soul. According to some, it was simply a lot. The hugs weren't brief, either. They could stretch into long silences, broken only by the sound of the fire and Belleran's slow breathing. Those who found the experience comforting swore it helped them confess more deeply than ever before. Those who didn't felt the whole thing was less about God and more about the priest's personal interpretation of pastoral care. Over time, the practice expanded. Belleran began offering extended comfort sessions after Mass, during which parishioners could discuss their troubles while sitting side by side with him in the parlour. These often included hand-holding, shoulder squeezes, and, in rare cases, the penitent leaning against him while he stroked their hair in what he described as a fatherly act of mercy. His regulars defended him fiercely, praising his kindness and saying they had never felt so seen by a spiritual leader. Others in the parish remained wary, unsure whether his warmth was purely pastoral or shaded into something else. When the bishop visited and heard about the practice, he raised an eyebrow, but stopped short of issuing a ban. "Just remember," he told Belaran, "the sacrament is about grace, not furniture arrangements." Belaran nodded politely and returned to his parlour the very next day, curtains drawn, love seat ready. Confession at St. Miriath's no longer resembled the brisk, impersonal rite found elsewhere. Here, sins were unburdened in a space that smelled faintly of wood smoke, where the line between spiritual comfort and physical closeness was blurred into something uniquely, and to some, uncomfortably, Father Belaran's own. Anointing is one of the oldest sacred acts, a blessing carried through oil, water, or incense. But the wandering healer Calvin claimed the most potent anointing required none of these. Instead, he practiced what he called anointing by breath. According to him, the Spirit moved on the wind, and when guided through a holy vessel, namely himself, it could cleanse, heal, and awaken those it touched. The method was exactly what it sounded like. Calvin travelled from village to village carrying no satchel of herbs or jars of oil. His only tools were his voice, his presence, and what he referred to as his breath of blessing. When someone approached him for healing, he would place his hands lightly on their temples or shoulders, close his eyes, and begin breathing slowly toward them. Sometimes it was a gentle exhale across their forehead, sometimes a long, deliberate breath over their closed lips. He insisted the latter was the deepest transfer, as it allowed the Spirit to move mouth to mouth, heart to heart. Witnesses often described the ritual as oddly intimate. Calvin's eyes would remain shut, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if guiding unseen forces into the other person. The recipient was told to inhale slowly, to draw in the blessing without fear, which, for some, was easier said than done. Those who believed in his gift claimed the warmth of his breath carried an almost electric charge, leaving them lightheaded or even teary. Others admitted they were mostly lightheaded from holding still while someone breathed directly into their face. Calvin himself seemed utterly convinced of his calling. He told stories of miraculous recoveries, a fever broken after 3 breaths, a broken heart mended after 7. He even developed a small repertoire of breath prayers, specific patterns of inhalation and exhalation that he said targeted different ailments. His breath of renewal was slow and steady. His breath of release came in short bursts, and his breath of union, reserved for particularly devout followers, was a prolonged exchange that left both parties standing far closer than polite distance usually allowed. Not everyone welcomed his approach. In one town, a group of elders asked him to stop blowing on the widows, which he dismissed as a misunderstanding of his intentions. In another, a local priest confronted him, arguing that the Holy Spirit did not require such proximity. Calvin only smiled and replied, "The Spirit comes as a breath, and I am simply helping it find its way." Despite the criticism, there was no shortage of those willing to try his method. People followed him from place to place, eager for the peculiar sensation of his living anointing. Whether it was truly divine or merely human warmth reframed in poetic language, Calvin's breath became his signature, a blessing carried not by oil or water, but by the slow exhale of a man convinced he was channeling heaven itself. Fasting has long been a way to discipline the body and sharpen the mind toward higher things. Most prophets encourage their followers to fast in solitude or in the company of their community. Prophet Thadriel, however, insisted that fasting only worked if it was done directly in his presence. He called it shared deprivation, claiming that spiritual hunger could only bear fruit if it was tethered to the anchor of a guiding soul, which, in his telling, meant him. His followers were not merely asked to skip meals. They were invited, or rather instructed, to gather in his private chambers for the duration of their fasts. These rooms were sparsely furnished, mats on the floor, heavy curtains drawn, and a low table with an empty platter placed dramatically in the center. The setting was meant to remind them of what they were denying themselves, though it also conveniently kept all eyes fixed on Thadriel, who sat cross-legged on the largest mat, his robes arranged with theatrical care. The ritual began with him speaking softly about the virtues of self-denial, often comparing food to worldly temptation and his presence to divine sustenance. Then came the hours of silence, during which participants were instructed to sit near him and absorb his spiritual energy as a substitute for eating. He would walk among them slowly, adjusting postures, touching shoulders, sometimes kneeling behind a follower to whisper encouragement into their ear. This, he said, helped feed the soul through closeness. The fasts could last anywhere from sunrise to well past midnight, depending on what Thadriel deemed necessary. Participants sometimes grew dizzy or weak, and he would respond by guiding them to recline against him, so that strength might pass from shepherd to sheep. Those who endured the full fast claimed they felt deeply bonded to him afterward, as though their hunger had knit them into his spirit. Others quietly admitted they had spent most of the time wondering when they'd be allowed to stand up. Critics outside the group saw it as less a spiritual discipline and more an exercise in dependency. Why, they asked, did fasting require physical nearness to one man? Thadriel dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand, saying outsiders simply did not understand the mystical circuit that connected him to the faithful. Despite the occasional fainting spell and the undeniable discomfort of sitting in a curtained room for 12 hours without food, the practice grew in popularity among his followers. They said the hunger was bearable when shared with the prophet, that his calm voice and quiet presence somehow made the absence of bread feel like an offering instead of a loss. Whether that sense of holiness came from genuine spiritual depth or from the peculiar intimacy of fasting shoulder to shoulder with their leader remained a question that no one inside the room seemed eager to answer. For most people, sleep is simply what happens at the end of the day, an unremarkable, unconscious necessity. For recluse Maelric, it was a spiritual art form, one that could unlock visions, heal the mind, and connect the soul to realms beyond waking thought. He lived alone in a weathered wooden lodge on the edge of the northern hills, but his isolation didn't stop people from seeking him out. They came because he offered something no other spiritual teacher dared to: sacred sleeping lessons. According to Maelric, most people slept wrong. They flopped into bed without intention, let their minds drift aimlessly, and missed the chance to travel inward. His method began with a lecture on posture, breathing, and opening the dream gate. An internal shift, he said, that could only be activated by lying down in his specially prepared vision chamber. This chamber was a low-lit room lined with furs and cushions, kept warm by a small brazier that filled the air with scented smoke. A single, oversized bed dominated the center. The lessons were always one-on-one. The participant would be invited to lie down while Maelric sat beside them, guiding their breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. His voice would drop to a near whisper, speaking of sacred landscapes and luminous beings awaiting them on the other side of sleep. He sometimes rested a hand on their arm or forehead, claiming it helped steady their passage. In longer sessions, he would remain seated close enough that his presence could be felt even in dreams. Some participants swore they experienced vivid visions under his guidance, flying over mountains, meeting ancestors, or receiving cryptic messages from radiant figures. Others, however, admitted they had simply fallen asleep and woken to find Maelric still sitting nearby, watching quietly as though ensuring they didn't stray too far from their dream path. His approach was not without controversy. A few visitors found the intimacy of the setting disconcerting, especially the way he insisted on arranging their blankets just so before they began. Rumours circulated that the lessons involved more than spiritual oversight, though nothing concrete was ever proven. Maelric himself dismissed the gossip with a gentle smile, saying, "Those who fear closeness will never know the deep dreams." Over time, his sacred sleeping lessons developed a loyal following. People would travel days just to spend a single night in the vision chamber, hoping to wake with the kind of clarity his students claimed to receive. Whether they found spiritual truth or simply a well-timed nap in a warm bed under the gaze of a patient recluse was a matter for their own conscience. But for Melrick, the act was always holy, because in his eyes, sleep wasn't an escape from life's journey. It was a road all its own, and he was there to guide every step, even the ones you took with your eyes closed. Most oracles read signs in the stars, the flight of birds, or patterns in tea leaves. Solora, the Oracle of Three Gates, claimed those methods were unnecessary when the greatest map of fate was written directly on the human body. She called her method skin reading, and her followers believed it allowed her to see past, present, and future through nothing more than her hands and a deeply focused gaze. Solora's chambers were dim and scented with resin smoke. Visitors would enter and find her seated on a low cushion, a bronze basin of warm water before her. After a short blessing, she would beckon the seeker closer, inviting them to bare an arm, a shoulder, or, if they were seeking life's full truth, more. She would dip her fingers into the water, then let them glide slowly over the skin, pausing at freckles, scars, or the faint lines of veins beneath the surface. Each mark, she said, was a word in the body's secret language. Her touch was unhurried, almost meditative. She traced spirals over the skin as she murmured impressions, a journey begun but unfinished. A heart that was both wounded and brave, a shadow that walks beside you, waiting. Sometimes she would lift her face to meet the seeker's eyes, holding the gaze for several breaths before returning to her reading. She claimed the temperature, texture, and tension beneath her fingertips all carried messages from the unseen world. Those who believed in her gift swore she revealed details no stranger could possibly know. The name of a lost childhood friend, the exact year a betrayal occurred, the place they would meet their next love. Others suspected her revelations were more the product of careful observation and practiced intuition than mystical insight. Still, even skeptics admitted the experience had a strange gravity to it, the kind that made you forget time was passing. Solora was selective about which parts of the body she would read, always maintaining that certain areas spoke louder than others. To some, this meant a simple palm or forearm. To others, especially those seeking answers about love or fertility, the readings ventured into far more personal territory, which she explained with perfect composure as necessary to hear the whispers beneath the surface. Her composure, of course, did little to quiet rumours about how much of the ritual was prophecy and how much was just contact. Despite the whispers, people kept coming. They left, clutching her cryptic pronouncements like treasures, convinced they had glimpsed something rare and important. Whether Solora truly saw visions or simply knew how to make her touch feel charged with meaning, the result was the same. Skin became scripture, and she was the only one who could read it. In most monasteries, grooming is a private matter, a quick trim, a wash, perhaps the occasional communal haircut. Brother Alvar of the High Ridge Monastery, however, insisted that grooming was not merely a matter of cleanliness, but a sacred act of discipleship. According to him, the path to humility and spiritual clarity could be found in submitting oneself to the hands of another. Conveniently, those hands were always his. Alvar's workshop sat in a sunny corner of the cloister, where a single wooden chair faced an open window. Around him were simple tools: combs, brushes, small scissors, and a set of scented oils. When a brother or visiting pilgrim sought his grooming guidance, Alvar would first speak of the importance of letting go of control. He said hair carried the weight of past sins and stray thoughts, and that removing it, or tending to it, in the right spirit could cleanse the soul. The ritual began with the participant kneeling before him while he stood close, brushing their hair with slow, deliberate strokes. He would lean in to examine every strand, murmuring prayers as the brush moved from crown to nape. If he found a tangle, he would work at it patiently, his fingers lingering longer than strictly necessary, claiming that knots represented the stubbornness of the ego and must be undone with both care and persistence. In some sessions, Alvar would trim away small locks of hair, letting them drift to the floor as offerings to the wind. In others, he would apply warm oil to the scalp, massaging it in circular motions while speaking of the spirit's descent into the body. Followers said these moments felt deeply calming, almost trance-like, as if the rhythmic touch carried them into a space beyond thought. Skeptics, on the other hand, described the whole thing as a very elaborate haircut with extra philosophy. The practice extended beyond hair. Alvar would sometimes shape beards, smooth brows, or even tend to nails, explaining that every act of grooming was a chance to remove the dust of worldly distraction. His insistence on personal involvement in all of this raised eyebrows, but his easy manner and constant flow of spiritual metaphors made it hard to accuse him of anything beyond enthusiastic pastoral care. Pilgrims began visiting High Ridge specifically for his grooming sessions, claiming they left not only looking better, but feeling lighter, as if some invisible burden had been brushed away. Whether that lightness came from spiritual renewal or simply from sitting still while someone fussed over them was never discussed too closely. Brother Alvar seemed content either way, because in his eyes, every snip, stroke, and smoothing pass of the comb was a step toward heaven, and he was more than willing to guide the way. One head at a time. Hermits are often associated with silence, but Hermit Jorath took it further, retreating to a cave so deep in the hillside that light itself seemed reluctant to enter. Here, he developed a practice he called breath counting in the dark, which he claimed could lead to enlightenment faster than years of conventional prayer. The method was deceptively simple. Sit in total darkness and count each breath until the self dissolved. In reality, the way Jorath conducted it made it far stranger than it sounded. Those seeking instruction had to first descend into his cavern, guided only by the sound of dripping water and the faint scrape of Jorath's staff on stone. Once inside, they found themselves in a space so black they could not see their own hands. The air was cool, heavy, and faintly damp. Jorath's voice would emerge from somewhere nearby. It was impossible to tell exactly where, instructing them to sit cross-legged on the ground. He explained that the darkness was essential because sight binds the soul to illusions, and only in the absence of light could the true breath be found. The ritual began with him leaning close enough for his breath to brush their ear as he counted the first 10 inhalations and exhalations aloud. After that, the participant was to continue silently, while Jorath moved around them, his bare feet making almost no sound. Every so often, he would pause just behind someone, exhaling softly to remind them of the cycle of life. If their breathing faltered, he would murmur corrections from the shadows, sometimes so close they could feel the vibration of his words along the back of their neck. The goal was to reach a state where one lost track of both time and count, merging into pure awareness. For some, this produced an uncanny sense of floating, as though the body had dissolved into the darkness. For others, it was simply an exercise in trying not to panic while being alone with their thoughts and an unseen hermit in the pitch black. Critics wondered why Jorath needed to be physically present for something people could easily do on their own. He replied that his presence held the space and prevented the mind from wandering too far. His followers insisted that knowing he was there, somewhere in the dark, listening, breathing, occasionally whispering encouragement, gave the practice a potency they couldn't replicate at home. Whether it was mystical discipline or just a very personal take on guided meditation, the experience left a mark. Participants would emerge blinking into daylight, swearing the world seemed sharper, colours brighter, their breath somehow deeper. Jorath would nod sagely and disappear back into the shadows, ready for the next seeker willing to count breaths in the company of a man who had made darkness his closest ally. Most people treat dreams as private, fleeting events, strange fragments that vanish in the morning light. Visionary Elthara disagreed. She believed dreams were sacred messages that lost their power if left unshared, and that the dreamer was never meant to carry them alone. Her solution was the dream witness ceremony, a practice in which followers would literally sleep in her presence so she could bear witness to their visions as they occurred. Elthara's sanctuary was a long, low room, lit only by lanterns and filled with rows of padded mats. At the far end stood her own bed, slightly elevated on a platform. The participant would lie down on their mat while she sat nearby, weaving a strand of bells into her hair, a sound she said would keep the veil open during the night. She would instruct them to relax and breathe deeply, speaking in slow, hypnotic tones about rivers of light and gates between worlds. Once the dreamer drifted into sleep, Elthara would quietly move to their side. She claimed she could sense the moment a dream began by the rhythm of the sleeper's breathing. At that point, she would lean close, sometimes hovering just inches above them, and murmur affirmations or questions into their ear, guiding the dream's direction. If they stirred, she would place a hand lightly on their arm or brow to keep them anchored. She insisted this allowed her to enter the dream alongside them, not in body, but in spirit, acting as both companion and witness. In the morning, the participant would wake to find Elthara sitting at their feet, already writing in a large leather-bound journal. She would then recount what she had seen in their dream, often with remarkable detail. Those who believed in her gift claimed she described scenes and symbols they had indeed experienced but never spoken aloud. Skeptics suspected she was simply skilled at reading expressions and movements during sleep, filling in the rest with poetic guesses. The intimacy of the ritual drew mixed reactions. Some felt profoundly supported, saying they had never before shared their subconscious life with another human being. Others found the thought of someone hovering over them in the middle of the night more unsettling than comforting. Still, Elthara maintained that the dreams themselves were grateful for the witness, and that failing to be observed left them lonely and unfinished. Word of her work spread, and pilgrims came from far away to sleep under her watch. Whether they left with divine revelations or just a heightened sense of being scrutinized in their sleep, all of them remembered the experience. Because in Elthara's eyes, dreams were not meant to be forgotten, and certainly not meant to happen without someone there to see them unfold. Silence is often praised as the language of the soul, but teacher Vorin turned it into a discipline so exacting it was more ordeal than peace. His philosophy was simple in theory. Words were distractions, and only by abandoning speech entirely could a person hear the truth within. But where most spiritual retreats kept silent periods to a few hours or perhaps a day, Vorin demanded far more. Days upon days of unbroken quiet, all under his constant supervision. His gatherings took place in a converted barn far from any village. The structure was stripped of furniture except for mats arranged in a circle around a central lamp. Participants were instructed to sit cross-legged and remain still, their eyes open, their mouths closed. Before the silence began, Vorin would pace slowly around the circle, reminding them of the rules. No talking, no gestures, no writing, no mouthing of words. Even sighs were to be kept to a minimum. The tongue is the root of noise, he would say, and noise is the root of blindness. Once the silence commenced, the atmosphere quickly shifted. At first, the only sounds were breathing and the occasional creak of the barn's wooden beams. But as hours passed, every small noise seemed amplified, a shuffle of feet, a cough, the distant sound of wind outside. Vorin moved quietly among them, his presence both watchful and strangely oppressive. If someone's eyes began to close, he would gently tap their shoulder. If someone fidgeted too much, he would crouch beside them, staring until they stilled again. The days were broken only by brief pauses for simple meals, which were eaten in the same rigid silence, with Vorin seated at the head of the table, his gaze moving from one person to another like a silent sentinel. Those who broke the silence, even accidentally, were asked to leave the circle for an hour to reflect on their weakness before returning. The punishment wasn't harsh in words, but the quiet disappointment in his eyes seemed to cut deeper than scolding. Some participants reported profound breakthroughs, a sense of clarity, heightened awareness, even moments of unexpected joy. Others confessed to feeling trapped inside their own thoughts, their minds circling endlessly around worries they could not speak aloud. For them, the stillness was less a spiritual revelation and more a battle against boredom and discomfort. Vorin insisted the discipline was worth it, claiming that prolonged silence scrubs the soul until it shines. And yet, the most vivid memory many carried away from his lessons was not of inner light, but of Voren himself, walking slowly in that circle, watching them like a shepherd who had decided the best way to guard his flock was to make sure none of them uttered a single sound. Most blessings come in the form of words, gestures, or symbols. A hand laid gently on the head, a prayer spoken aloud, a cross traced in the air. These are the tools spiritual leaders have used for centuries, but mystic Ilarion claimed none of these were necessary. To him, a true blessing did not require touch, speech, or ceremony. It only required being near him. He called it blessing through proximity, a method that was as baffling in theory as it was in practice. According to Ilarion, the human spirit emitted a subtle field of divine energy that radiated outward in all directions. In his case, he claimed, this energy was unusually strong, so strong that those who simply spent time close to him would receive healing, insight, and spiritual renewal without needing to do anything at all. No chanting, no kneeling, no incense, no elaborate rites. Just being there. His gatherings were unlike any others. Instead of sermons, meditations, or rituals, Ilarion invited his followers to sit in a circle around him in complete stillness. The sessions were held in a modest hall with bare walls, a few cushions, and a faint smell of sandalwood lingering in the air. He would enter quietly, take his seat in the center, and close his eyes. That was it. No words, no gestures, just him breathing slowly while the others stared at him or stared at the floor, waiting for something. The faithful swore they felt it. A warmth in the chest, a tingling in the fingertips, a curious lightness in the head. Some described it as if a heavy burden had been lifted without a single word being exchanged. Others said it felt like sitting under the sun on a cool day, subtle but undeniable. Ilarion never confirmed or denied their accounts. He only smiled faintly, as if the results spoke for themselves. The gatherings could last anywhere from an hour to half a day. Occasionally, Ilarion would shift his position, walking slowly around the circle so that each person had their turn being directly beside him. When someone was new, he often paused near them a little longer, letting the silence stretch. He claimed this helped attune them to his field. In these moments, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an expectancy that was almost awkward. But no one spoke, because speaking was unnecessary. And in Ilarion's method, unnecessary was the enemy. Not everyone was impressed. Visitors who came out of curiosity often left unconvinced, describing the whole affair as just sitting in a room with a man who likes being the center of attention. But his devoted followers insisted the critics simply weren't sensitive enough to feel it, or that they were too impatient to notice the subtle shifts happening within them. After all, not every blessing could be measured in the moment. Some, Ilarion taught, unfolded slowly over days or weeks. When questioned about why he alone seemed to have this extraordinary ability, he would give a small shrug and say, "It is not mine. It flows through me, as it could through anyone who is willing to be still." Whether this was humility or a carefully crafted mystique was anyone's guess. Regardless of skepticism, people continued to come. Some travelled days just to spend an afternoon in his silent company. Others returned again and again, claiming their lives had changed in ways they could not explain. Broken relationships mended, anxieties eased, opportunities appearing as if by divine arrangement. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps it was suggestion, or perhaps, as Ilarion believed, a blessing really could pass from one soul to another without a single word or touch, carried quietly on the invisible air between two people sitting very, very close. Some spiritual teachers sit cross-legged for hours, insisting that stillness is the key to awakening. Guide Tareth believed the opposite. For him, stillness bred stagnation, and the path to enlightenment was quite literally a path, one you walked without pause, without destination, and without the comfort of knowing when it would end. He called his method endless walking, a practice that sounded simple until you experienced it under his rules. Tareth's retreats began at dawn, when participants gathered at the edge of a long, winding road leading out of the valley. He would appear in his plain linen robe, a staff in hand, and offer a short reminder, "Your feet will carry you where thought cannot." Then he began walking. There were no formal instructions beyond that. No maps, no schedule, no planned rest stops. The only requirement was to keep moving. The pace was slow but steady, deliberately chosen to prevent exhaustion, while allowing no opportunity to drift into a lazy shuffle. Participants were told not to speak, not to hum, not to let their eyes wander too much. The focus was always on the rhythm of step after step after step. Tareth insisted that the mind, stripped of distraction, would eventually dissolve into a pure awareness that could only be found mid-stride. Hours passed, and the walking continued. The path might loop through forests, along riverbanks, or across dusty plains. Sometimes it circled back toward the starting point without ever reaching it. Other times it wandered into unfamiliar ground. When someone asked where they were going, Tareth would simply say, "Forward." When someone asked when they would stop, his answer was always, "When the walking is complete." This could mean anything from sunset to the middle of the night. The real test was endurance, not just of the legs, but of the mind. At first, participants tried to keep track of time or distance, counting steps or watching the angle of the sun. Eventually, most gave up, surrendering to the strange timelessness of the march. Some described it as meditative, their thoughts smoothing out into a quiet hum. Others admitted to feeling trapped, as though the road had become a kind of moving prison. Tareth occasionally altered the formation, moving to walk beside someone for a time before drifting to another. He never spoke, but his silent presence seemed to weigh heavily. Followers claimed that when he walked near them, their fatigue lifted, replaced by a lightness in the legs and a strange clarity in the mind. Skeptics chalked it up to the simple motivation of being observed by the leader. Rest breaks were rare and brief. A few sips of water, perhaps a moment to stretch, before the line moved again. Food was eaten on the move, small portions carried in pockets or pouches. Nights on longer journeys were spent in simple shelters along the route, only for the walking to resume at first light. By the end, participants were sore, footsore, and strangely hollowed out. Yet many swore that in the middle of the endless walking there had been moments, fleeting but real, where the self seemed to dissolve, where they felt as though they were not walking but being walked, carried forward by something vast and silent. Whether that was enlightenment or simply exhaustion was up for debate. But for Tareth, there was no question. If you wanted to leave the noise of the mind behind, you had to walk far enough that you forgot you ever had one. Confession in most traditions is a spoken act, an unburdening of the soul through carefully chosen words. The elder known only as Mavren refused to hear them. In his eyes, words were clumsy, prone to disguise as much as they revealed. He believed that the truth of a person's guilt could be seen without a single sentence being spoken, and so he invented his practice of confession without words. Those who came to him found it both unnerving and strangely relieving, though not always for the same reasons. Mavrin lived in a narrow stone hut on the edge of the mountains, where the wind rattled through the shutters like a restless spirit. Inside, the only furniture was a low stool for him, a simple mat for the visitor, and a small oil lamp that barely lit the space. When a seeker arrived, Mavren would motion for them to sit and then settle himself opposite them, folding his hands in his lap. From that moment, the silence began. The ritual was straightforward in theory. The visitor would sit and think of what they wished to confess, holding it in their mind while Mavren studied them. He would lean slightly forward, his eyes fixed, scanning every flicker of their expression, every shift in posture, every twitch of fingers or tightening of the jaw. His gaze was unbroken and unblinking for what felt like impossibly long stretches of time. At first, most tried to maintain composure, presenting a calm mask, but Mavren was patient, far more patient than they were. As the minutes dragged on, the weight of his silent scrutiny began to work on them. The stillness magnified every small discomfort, the urge to look away, the heat creeping into the face, the restless shifting of the body. For some, the silence became unbearable, as if the unspoken guilt itself was growing louder in the room. When Mavren sensed he had seen enough, he would slowly close his eyes, inhale deeply, and exhale through his nose. Then, in a voice low and even, he would tell the visitor what he believed their unspoken confession to be. Sometimes he was eerily accurate, naming details they had never shared with another soul. Other times he spoke in vague metaphors. You have held the stone too long in your hand, leaving the seeker to interpret it as they wished. Those who believed in his gift said his accuracy came from divine insight. Skeptics suspected it was nothing more than sharp observation and an understanding of human nature combined with a talent for reading the signs of guilt. But even the doubters admitted there was something powerful in sitting across from someone who refused to let you hide behind words. After the confession, Mavran would offer a brief blessing or simply nod in acknowledgement, signaling the session was complete. There was no penance, no instruction, only the quiet knowledge that the truth had been seen. For some, that was enough. The experience often left people unsettled, not because they had been accused, but because they had been understood without speaking. They left his hut walking a little slower, thinking a little harder about the invisible weight they carried. Whether Mavran had truly seen into their hearts, or simply held up a mirror for them to see themselves, the result was the same. Silence had done what words so often failed to. It had brought them face to face with their own truth. Some seers work with elaborate tools, crystal balls, tarot cards, bowls of sacred water. Serenia, however, claimed she needed only a candle and the human face. Her practice, which she called visions by candlelight, was as much a performance as it was a ritual, though her followers swore the results were genuine. According to her, candlelight revealed not only the contours of the present, but the shifting shapes of the future, hidden in the way shadows moved across the skin. Her sessions were always held at night in a room entirely without windows. The only light came from a single beeswax candle placed on a low table between her and the seeker. As soon as the door closed, she would light the wick with a long match, letting the flame burn high before trimming it to a steady glow. The rest of the room dissolved into darkness, and all attention fell on the flickering light between them. Serenia would lean forward, her elbows resting on the table, her eyes fixed on the seeker's face. She instructed them to remain still, to say nothing, and to keep their gaze loosely on her. As the flame danced, shadows shifted across their features, lengthening here, vanishing there, throwing certain lines into sharp relief. She would murmur observations under her breath, sometimes in a language no one could quite place, other times in slow, deliberate phrases. The path ahead is narrow, but unbroken. A stranger will know your name before you speak it. The most unsettling part was how close she sat, near enough that the seeker could feel the warmth of the flame on their skin and smell the faint sweetness of the beeswax. Every flicker of light seemed to change the mood, sometimes softening her expression, sometimes making her eyes glint sharply in the dark. Followers said the effect was mesmerizing, as if the candlelight had its own will, guiding the reading as much as Serencia did. Occasionally she would lean even closer, letting the shadows fall across her own face, as if to remind the seeker that they were not merely being observed, they were part of an exchange. She claimed that in those moments, the flame itself was whispering visions to her. Skeptics dismissed this as theatrics, but even they admitted that sitting so still, so close, in near total darkness could play tricks on the mind. Shapes did seem to form in the periphery, and expressions could appear to shift without moving at all. Her visions varied in tone. Sometimes they were hopeful, promising reunions, journeys, or newfound clarity. Other times they carried warnings of betrayal, of missteps, of paths that must be avoided at all costs. She never offered specifics on how to change the future she described, only that knowing was the first step to preparing. "The light shows what it must," she would say, snuffing the candle to end the session. Whether it was the hypnotic quality of the setting, the intimacy of the gaze, or something more mysterious, people returned again and again. Many left believing they had truly been shown a piece of the future, if only for a fleeting moment in the wavering glow of a single flame. And if nothing else, they carried away the memory of that quiet room, the warmth of the candlelight, and the strange conviction that, for a little while, the shadows themselves had been speaking. Most spiritual teachers anchor themselves to a temple, a shrine, or a particular community. Not so for Maelor the Wanderer. To him, any fixed point was a trap, any roof a cage. He taught that divinity was not found in sacred texts or within the walls of holy places, but in the act of moving, endlessly, without final destination. His doctrine was simple to repeat, but exhausting to live. The road itself is God. Those who wished to follow Maelor quickly discovered that his road was not a metaphor. It was an actual road, or a path, or a track, whatever line of travel stretched ahead. It could be a smooth stone highway leading toward a city, or a jagged goat trail winding through the hills. What mattered was not where it led, but that it led somewhere, and that the feet kept moving. The moment you stopped for too long, he said, the divine current slipped away. Maelor's life was a constant pilgrimage, though he rejected the word pilgrimage because it implied a final sacred destination. The road is the shrine, he would say, and each step is the prayer. He carried little, just a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder, a walking stick polished smooth from years of use, and a battered leather journal in which he recorded not thoughts, but the names of places he passed through. He never stayed in one place more than a few nights, and even then, only to let a rainstorm pass or to wait for an injury to heal. The journey began at dawn each day, whether his companions were ready or not. He would set a pace that was brisk enough to discourage idle chatter, but slow enough to keep from exhausting those less accustomed to the miles. Talking was not forbidden, but it was discouraged. He claimed words distracted from the rhythm of walking and the subtle conversation between the traveller and the road beneath their feet. When a follower asked what that conversation sounded like, Maelor simply tapped the ground with his staff and said, "You'll hear it once you stop trying to listen." Meals were taken where they happened to be, beside a stream, under a leaning pine, crouched at the edge of a dusty track. Food was whatever could be carried easily or foraged along the way. Bread grew hard, cheese wore thin, berries stained fingers and tongues. Maelor considered the hunger between meals a holy reminder that nothing permanent could be carried. At night, he refused to camp in the same place twice. Shelters were improvised. A rock overhang, a hollowed log, the lee side of a barn when farmers were charitable. More often than not, the stars were the only roof. On clouded nights, the darkness was complete, broken only by the faint glow of a smouldering fire. Those who stayed with him long enough learned to sleep lightly and wake early, their dreams shaped by the uneven ground beneath them. The road itself became their constant, twisting, stretching, rising and falling with a will of its own. In rain, it turned slick and treacherous. In heat, it shimmered and dusted their legs in a fine film. Maelor taught his companions to treat each change in the road as a change in God's mood. A sudden fork was a question, a steep climb was a demand, a narrow pass was a warning. When the road opened wide and straight, it was a blessing, though one that never lasted long. Not everyone who joined him endured for long. The blisters, the constant uncertainty of where the day would end, the absence of comfort, these sent many back to fixed roofs and predictable meals. But those who remained began to feel something shift in them. The days blurred together, not because they were forgettable, but because each felt part of one unbroken thing. They no longer thought of journeys as separate from arrivals. The road, in all its changing forms, became the whole of life. Maelor never preached in the conventional sense. His teachings came in brief, almost offhand remarks delivered while walking, a comment about the way grass bowed in the wind, or how a certain bend in the road felt heavier than it looked. Followers learned to listen for these small observations, as they often hinted at the deeper truth he was always circling. That movement was not a means to find God, but the way to remain in God's presence. The most striking part of his doctrine was his refusal to promise any reward for the endless journey. There was no heaven at the end of the road, no enlightenment waiting after the 1,000th mile. The journey was the reward, and stopping was the only loss. Some found this liberating, others found it unbearable, needing some final point to walk toward. For Maelor, there was only forward, and then forward again. He was not sentimental about departures. When someone told him they could no longer continue, he would nod, wish them a safe path, and walk on without looking back. In his view, the road would eventually bring them together again, not through fate, but because all roads, in some way, were the same road. Over the years, Mailer's reputation spread, and people would sometimes join him for a day or two just to say they had walked with the wanderer. These brief companions often left confused, expecting deep conversation or dramatic insight. Instead, they received silence, the sound of steady footsteps, and perhaps a single cryptic sentence before parting. Those who truly understood him knew that this was the point. The road was speaking all the time. Mailer was just there to keep them from stepping off it. When asked if he ever grew tired, he smiled faintly and said, "Of course, but tired feet are still on the road. It is when they stop that they begin to die." And with that, he would shift his satchel, adjust his staff, and keep walking, the long, unbroken line of his life stretching onward into the horizon, the road beneath him as close to God as he ever cared to be.